last section, we looked at the public theaters of Elizabethan England. The public theater structure of scene house and raised stage, which evolved from the medieval mansion, affected the way that plays were performed during this time period. The scene house, from which actors could make their entrances and exits, were a permanent part of the playhouse. There was also an upper section of the scene house that could be used for additional scenes, or from where musicians could perform during the play production. This arrangement made for little opportunity for scenery. There were some conventions that were used for scenery, like occasionally an actor would bring a limb of a tree on the stage to convey to the audience that the action occurred outdoors, or a banquet table was brought in from the stage house to indicate that the action was taking place in a banquet hall. The scene was most often set by what the characters were saying as they entered. If a character was commenting on the stormy weather that was approaching as he trotted along this rocky road, the audience knew that the scene that followed was out of doors. If the character commented on the aroma of the food cooking, the audience would then allow themselves to be transported into an Italian kitchen. It's often thought that this limitation forced Shakespeare and the other playwrights of the period to devise some of the most beautiful and descriptive language of any play, so as to allow the audience to use their imagination and create beautiful settings in their minds. While the public theaters were becoming very popular in London, their limitations caused the creator of the first permanent theatre of London, James Burbage, to consider building an indoor theatre. This led to the creation of the private theatres of Elizabethan England. Burbage was further induced to create a playhouse other than the theatre because he was embroiled in conflict with the landlord of the property on which the theatre was built. He learned that his landlord was planning to seize the property once the lease was up. So he made arrangements to build a smaller version of the theatre inside a monastery. The monastery was inside the city limits of London, and because it was under the jurisdiction of the Crown, the Puritans were unable to prevent its construction. The monastery was the Blackfriars, and, as was the custom, the monastery housed a school for boys. One of the activities of the educational program of a monastery school were public speeches, musical presentations, and recitations. It's likely that Burbage worked out an arrangement with the head of the monastery to build a theatre that the boys could use during the day and where his own play company could perform at night. While it's uncertain why these playhouses were referred to as private theatres, it's generally believed that because they were smaller, they needed to charge higher admission that was affordable only to the affluent. As a result, they functioned more like private clubs rather than a public facility such as the public playhouses or gaming arenas. They also differed from the public theaters in that they were constructed inside existing structures that had a roof. They were lit by candlelight or torches. They also had a stage and scene house like the public theaters, but they were much smaller and, in many cases, much more ornate. The most prominent private theatres were the Blackfriars, built by Burbage, and the Whitefriars, also a private theatre built inside a monastery. Other private theatres were built inside taverns and inns of locations within the city limits that were referred to as liberties. Like the monasteries, a few other locations within the city limits of London were either under the jurisdiction of the Crown or some nobleman and could not be restricted by the Puritans and other municipal authorities. Even though the locations themselves could not be restricted by the local authorities, the private theaters were troubled by their opponents' ability to restrict crowds from gathering outside the private theaters. As a result, the private theaters ultimately were used only by the boys' companies. The boys' companies were made up of the students of the monasteries. Because their theater activities were tied to the monastery school, they did not meet with such resistance as did the adult companies that tried to perform in the private theaters. Shortly after James Burbage completed construction of the Blackfriars, he met with such resistance. It looked as though his race to secure a suitable replacement for his public playhouse would not occur, as the lease for the theatre was running out. While in the process of locating land on which to build another theatre, James Burbage died, leaving the theater and the Blackfriars to his sons, Richard and Cuthbert. As legend has it, the Burbage sons, along with their company of actors, took down the theater board by board without the landlord's knowledge, and floated the woodwork from the dismantled structure across the Thames River to the south bank, where they leased some land. On this new property, they constructed a larger theater, and this is how the famous Globe Theater came into being. Well, it's time for your task for this section. When we come back, we'll continue our discussion of Elizabethan theater.